This is Ed Asner, and you're listening to No Lies Radio.
This is Guns and Butter.
There's something happening, yeah. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there.
This is a basic strategy in the original shock and awe doctrine. You are not to let your adversary recover. You keep relentlessly hitting them. And so you give them 9/11, and then you give them the Anthrax attacks. And then if you can do a few more bombings in Europe and in London a little bit later, whenever people start to feel comfortable, you hit them with another terrorist attack. That's the only thing that's kept this stupid war on terror going, is, you know, every now and then there'll be another one of these attacks. Most of them, to the extent that I can tell by looking at them, most of them are cooked up to keep things going. So that's the Anthrax attacks. It's strike number 2 on the U.S. It enables the Patriot Act to go through.
I'm Bonnie Faulkner. Today on Guns and Butter, Dr. Graeme MacQueen. Today's show, Connecting the Anthrax Attacks to September 11th. Graeme MacQueen taught in the Religious Studies Department of McMaster University in Ontario for 30 years. In 1989, he became founding director of the Center for Peace Studies at McMaster, after which he helped develop the BA program in Peace Studies and oversaw the development of peace-building projects in Sri Lanka, Gaza, Croatia, and Afghanistan. Since taking early retirement from McMaster, most of his research has focused on the events of 9/11. He currently serves on the board of directors of the International Center for 9/11 Studies, which has secured the release of numerous photographs and videos held by the U.S. government. Today we discuss the structural, historical, and symbolic approaches to understanding the anthrax attacks and take a look at the connections between the attacks of September 11th and anthrax. Dr. Graeme MacQueen, welcome.
Thank you, Bonnie. It's a privilege to be on the show.
As a co-founder and director of McMaster University's Center for Peace Studies, you had occasion to attend a conference in Peshawar, Pakistan in the months leading up to September 11th, 2001, I believe in February of 2001. What was the conference about? Who was in attendance? And what occurred there that presaged the invasion of Afghanistan?
Well, it was actually a little bit more than a conference. I'd call it a really intensive, extended workshop. The Center for Peace Studies that I'd been involved in had gone together with the Center for International Health at my university and had chosen a few parts of the world that especially needed help with peace building, and were doing projects in them. And Afghanistan was chosen pretty early, and we'd had teams going to the country off and on since 1993. And I had gone to Afghanistan myself in 1995, though I'm not usually much of a field person. I usually kept things going back in Canada. But in any case, we had a couple of projects funded by the Canadian government and by various other organizations. And in 2001, we were there to give a week of pretty intensive full-day workshops. For 5 days a week, basically 9 to 5, we were with 100 Afghans who'd been chosen in advance. About 30 were former Afghan cabinet ministers. Some were media people, other prominent people, university people, and 10 out of the 100 were women, which isn't a very good representation, but it was pretty good under the circumstances. Actually, not that easy. And I should say that I don't want to take a lot of credit for this workshop. It was designed by 2 other people, one of whom is living and working in Afghanistan now. He's an Afghan Canadian. And the other was a man generally called the father of peace research, Norwegian Johan Galtung. And Galtung has worked in conflict regions all over the world. And he was really the main designer of this thing, and I was there in the capacity of helping him, along with several other people. So there we were, 9 to 5, 5 days, working intensely. What can Afghans do about their conflict? Or I should say conflicts, because they rapidly identified several. There's not just one conflict. And lots of brainstorming, lots of small group work, lots of little reports submitted, lots of interesting ideas. And we saw the level of hope going up as the workshop continued, because a lot of people had been reduced pretty close to despair at that time. I should have explained that we were in Peshawar because our government discouraged us this time from going to Afghanistan. So we chose as our partner a university called the Afghan University, which had been set up by Afghan refugees in Peshawar, Pakistan, because there's a huge refugee population there. So they were our partners, we were there, they were hosting us, and so on and so on. Now, the part you're referring to took place, I can't remember whether it was the second day or the third day or whatever, but people were generating ideas for what could be done about Afghanistan. And one gentleman, as I recall him, bearded but dressed in sort of Western clothes, a nice suit and so on, stood up and said basically, you know, you're coming up with good ideas, but the United States will soon be creating a war in Afghanistan. They want the oil, and they also want a permanent base, which they intend to build here. So everything that we're doing is of no avail. That's almost a direct quote. I have his words here. And then he sat down again, and as I recall, kind of a bit of a silence, because, as I say, the level of hope had been going up, and what were we supposed to do with this? I didn't know what to make of it. I had been involved in peace work and anti-war work, both as an academic and an activist for a lot of years. So I don't think I had any illusions about imperial powers. I didn't sort of think, oh, gee, you know, the American government would never invade Afghanistan. Of course they would, under some circumstances. But there were a couple of things troubling me that I found hard to understand. First of all, you know, would they really be stupid enough to invade Afghanistan, because it's been invaded by a lot of great powers, and they sooner or later come to grief. It doesn't work, right? It didn't work with the British, didn't work with the Soviets, and so on. So that was the first thing. But also, I thought, what conceivable pretext could they cook up for an invasion of one of the poorest, most miserable countries in the world? All you had to do was look at the infant mortality rate and so on. This was just such a weak and impoverished country. And I remembered in 1979 when the Soviets invaded, how they were condemned all over the world, and there was great puffing and huffing in the West about how this showed how inherently aggressive, you know, communism was, and so on and so forth. And we all agreed that the Soviets had done an unjust thing and also a very stupid thing. Now, really, were the Americans, it seemed to me, was the American government stupid enough to do the same thing? No pretext. Afghanistan wasn't a threat to the United States, and so on and so forth. You get the point. That's one of these occasions where you take that little comment the man makes, and a few other comments, by the way, at the same time. Some people told me that U.S. forces could already be seen on the ground around there. I didn't know what to make of that either. So I put this in a little shelf in my mind, and it wasn't until much later that I brought it out again and thought about it and thought, you know, if I'd really been awake at that point, really been with it, I might have seen some of the 9/11 stuff and the subsequent invasion of Afghanistan more readily, and I might have understood them better when they did happen.
Well, do you have any idea who this person was or where he was getting his information?
No, and even if I did remember his name, I probably couldn't give it for confidentiality reasons. However, as I said, about 30% of the people in our conference were former Afghan ministers in the government, and they had connections, of course, in Pakistan. And I would be very surprised if he weren't a well-connected man with Pakistani intelligence and so on. I should say that the leader of the workshop, I spoke to Johan Galtung about this a year ago. I said, Johan, I remember, you know, I was reading over the minutes and I'm remembering this guy speaking. I said, do you remember this incident? And he said, oh, of course I do. I was intrigued. So I went up to him and wanted more information. And he took me to his office later and he showed me the maps and so on and so forth. So obviously the guy felt he had a lot of information, but I can only speculate as to where he got it. I mean, we later learned, of course, that there had been things published in various Asian newspapers saying that the United States would, in fact, be invading in the fall, invading Afghanistan. I think it's the Asia Times. I have the article around here somewhere that said that in the summer. But we didn't get, at least I don't remember getting any news about that in my media. So it was a great surprise to me later to go back and see that this information was floating around if you knew where to look.
Wow, that's very interesting. And at the time that you were conducting these workshops in Peshawar, the Taliban were in control of most of Afghanistan, right?
That's correct. The Taliban have been taking over. When I was there in '95, they were on the move, and everyone, who are these people, what are they up to, and we got various interesting answers, but we were in Herat, and they hadn't taken over Herat yet. By the time of 2001, they controlled almost all the country. The Northern Alliance maintained a small presence, but most of it had been taken over by the Taliban. I just wanted to mention, the Taliban are very much demonized over here as if they're from another planet, but they're not all that unusual. They're similar in many ways to other mujahideen groups. And there were a couple of Taliban advocates and supporters in the room in our workshops, and the Taliban themselves showed up one day, to express their views about what we were doing. So it's not like they were considered particularly rare or unusual over there.
Well, switching the subject a little bit, one of your most important areas of research has been the anthrax attacks that began a week after 9/11. You have pointed out that the anthrax attacks of September-October 2001 are intimately connected to the events of September 11th. What do the effects of the anthrax attacks have in common with September 11th?
Yeah, I should say actually that that's how I got into studying the anthrax attacks. Mainly I'm a researcher these days on the events of 9/11, which I consider to be fraudulent. I consider it to be a false flag operation. But, I eventually realized, you can't keep avoiding the anthrax attacks because, they happened at almost exactly the same time. They had similar structure and effects, and everything you hear about them suggests that they're fraudulent too, so it's time to look into it. So I took a few months off to study it, and that's where I'm coming from. I'm coming from it as somebody who wants to understand the so-called global war on terror and wants to understand the role of the fall of 2001, in which these two major attacks on the U.S. homeland occurred, the 9/11 attacks, and then, as you said, starting a week later, the anthrax attacks. So to get to your question, what do they have in common? There are actually several different ways of looking at that. You can do a structural analysis, symbolic analysis, or historical analysis. But let me start with